And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Scott Jameson, who's a very important and very active board member. He's with the Bartlett Tree Experts, but he also has a very special relationship with tree keepers. So, Scott.
Thank you, Jerry. It's great to be here. I was involved with tree keepers from the beginning, 20 years ago. Suzanne and I sitting around a table with a bunch of other folks trying to figure out what we're going to do with this group. And a little known fact, we were going to call tree keepers something else. Anybody know what that was? Citizen foresters. And we were actually going to issue badges and have people bust out others for bad tree care practices. But the city wouldn't allow it, so we opted to tree keepers. True story. Two quick stories about tree keepers. Early in our work, we were doing a workday project downtown, and somebody came out and said, hey, you know, taking care of trees makes me want to wash my windows. And another project where we were planting trees in a tough area, somebody said, you know what, when the man comes in, Michael, when the man comes in and plants trees, they get ripped out overnight. When we plant trees together, we take care of them forever. And that always has stuck with me. When we do things together, how much better things come out. For me, there's a unique connection with trees. Our organization, Bartlett's been involved with the 9/11 Memorial Project in New York City. We've cared for these trees for 5 years, getting them ready to be planted into the memorial. And nothing made me more aware of the connection of people and trees when I heard somebody in an interview, a sister of somebody that died in Cantor Fitzgerald, talking about how the trees would comfort those that went to the memorial. And if you go to the memorial, I guarantee you those trees will comfort you. There's something unique about trees that connects us to something bigger than ourselves. And I'm so happy to have Diana Wells here and to finally get to introduce her. I happen to know her favorite tree is a Stewartia, which is hard to find here in Chicago, but there's a few. She's the author of The Lives of Trees, An Uncommon History, as well as many other naturalist books. She has written for the Friends Journal and is the contributing editor of the journal Green Prints. Born in Jerusalem, she lived in England and Italy and holds an honors degree from Oxford. She lives with her husband, Charles, who's here with us today on a farm in Pennsylvania. Please welcome Diana Wells.
Well, on an occasion like this, I'm reminded of my Uncle Arthur, who promised me sixpence if I could stop talking for 5 minutes. I did it, but it was hard. Now, the best way I could represent trees to you people would be stand here for 15 minutes and say nothing. Because we've had a very long association with trees. We've lived with them, in them, used their products, worshipped them. We're inextricably united with them. But as far as I know, we've never been able to speak to them. Which begs the question, what would they say if they could speak to us? Now, I want to tell you a story that happened in Philadelphia in 1782. As you know, Philadelphia was founded by William Penn, a Quaker, and it was to be a green country town. Every town was to have a garden, all the streets would have trees, and there would be open spaces. 1682, I should have said. The story's about 1782. In 1782, the Assembly of Philadelphia suddenly announced that every tree in the city was to be cut down. They obstructed passageway, their roots got into pavements, and the fire insurance company said that they were a danger to fire. Extraordinary, isn't it? The next day, not quite the next day, a little while later, a pamphlet began to be circulated around the city called the Post's Oration. And it purported to be an account of the meeting in which one of the posts that held up the ceiling suddenly, magically, began to speak. It said it was a standing member of the House, that it attended every meeting. The state of of Pennsylvania had been named after its ancestors, and that it was the trees were important, this is the bit, had to be in the city for the health of the inhabitants. This is in 1782. It said the trees had a right to be citizens, just as humans did. They needed water, they needed air, and they lasted longer. Even after death, they helped humans. Well, this pamphlet had the most extraordinary effect, because only a couple of months later, that edict was repealed. The fire company said they would insure people, and one of the companies even put a tree on its logo. So you see, it can be done, and you people are doing it very well. Now, about the same time, 2 new trees were introduced into North America, specifically Philadelphia. One was the Italian poplar, and it became wildly fashionable as a street tree. It was planted everywhere, avenues in Philadelphia, avenues in Boston, avenues in Washington. But of course, it wasn't a very good street tree, as we now know, because its roots got into drains and it wasn't long-lived, and soon it had to be replaced. And this brings me to the difference between urban street trees and forest trees. Urban trees I think of as tame trees. The other tree that was introduced, and I'm going to talk about in a minute, was the ginkgo. But you can't just go planting trees in cities. You have to know about them. Some drop fruits which are messy, some smell, some branches break off some of them. Some, as I said, the roots get into drains. We need to know about our trees, not just think of them as trees. They each have a story, they're individuals. And as I say, the poplar fell into disrepute, as indeed I think the Bradford pear has in our time a little bit, because it's not very long-lived. There were 2 different kinds of trees. There were wild trees in forests, and we're not going to talk about those today, because in the old days, a forest was not a place of solace, it was a place of fear. Forest means outside. It was outside civilization. Outlaws lived in forests, bandits lived in forests. They didn't want trees beside the roads because people could hide in them and rob you. But we've always had trees in cities. And trees in cities have to be our neighbors. Now, as we know, it's almost impossible to have a perfect neighbor. And trees are the same as people. So the main thing I want to emphasize is we have to know our trees. We have to know our individual trees. We have to treat them as our friends. And then we can have urban forests. And that in itself is so essential. Everybody here knows it, but I can't emphasize it too much. In the old days, and I think these maybe soon too, we had to have trees for shade. Can you imagine tying a horse and buggy up in one of our parking lots? It would die when you come back from shopping. Now what we do is we put one of those silver things in front of our windshields and we get in the car and we turn the air conditioning up as high as it'll go. And we do the same with our offices, and we should do the same with our houses. But of course, we're relying on fossil fuels. And we want to turn to our friends, the trees. So the other tree that came, Jerry wanted me to talk about a few individual trees, which I can do, but not too many. It was the ginkgo. It came at the same time as the tulip poplar, and it was planted in the garden of someone called William Hamilton outside Philadelphia. And that tree, although garden was ended, the tree went on into the 1980s, 200 years. And the ginkgo is a very wonderful example of a tame tree because it was hardly to be found in the wild. It was saved in Buddhist temple gardens. And when they came to look for it in the wild, there were really hardly any. The odd ones were found. And then it was taken by Buddhist monks, along with tea drinking, to Japan. And then in due course, it came to us. There's only one kind of ginkgo. And although we think there were many, many in the past. And it came before, it evolved before insects, so it's rather a good tree, street tree, because insects tend to avoid it. And it has this unique leaf called biloba. Its botanical name is Ginkgo biloba, which is like a duck's foot or something. And it's divided in two. And just so you have something to go home with, I'll tell you about the poet Goethe, who had a ginkgo in front of his house, and he spent a lot of time wondering whether it represented two beings fused as one, or one being divided. You can take that home with you. I'm not going into it. But here we get to the street tree part. The ginkgo has a male and female variety, as do some trees. Some have male and female fruits on each tree, and the ginkgo is one of them, dioecious it's called. And you must plant male ginkgos, because although the seed of the ginkgo is edible, it's surrounded by a very, very, very smelly pulp. And if you get it wrong, you're going to have quite a lot of people complaining. So we go on. Jerry asked me to talk a little bit about the oak, which is an interesting tree because it absolutely represents our relationship with trees. We've used oaks more than any other tree in the world, but we've also worshipped them more than any other tree in the world. And the British used 1,500 trees to make one battleship. And they especially used the big branch, the forked branch, to make the transom because it had such a strong joint, much stronger than any could. So by the time the Europeans came to America, they were very pleased to find oaks because they had pretty much decimated their own oaks. And they had also used up all the pines for masts. So the pine trees were a very good find. And for a long time, the pine trees were king's property before the British were rightfully removed. Now, the other tree I'm going to talk, by the way, the name of the oak, the name of Druids comes from Durac, which is the old Gaelic name for oak. Now, the other tree that Jerry asked me to mention is the Tamarack. And I wanted to mention this because it's one of the very few trees that still has a Native American name. Now, the Europeans came to America and they saw trees that looked like the trees at home. So they called them by the same name, which is, of course, immensely confusing to us now because cedars aren't cedars and pines aren't pines and you name it. But the Tamarack is a real Native American name. Another one is the catalpa. And the Native American Indians, the Algonquin tribe, used the fibers of the Tamarack's roots to sew together their canoes. So, of course, it meant getting under the tree. And I want to read you a verse from Hiawatha. It goes, Hiawatha says, "Give me of your roots, O Tamarack, of your fibrous roots, O large tree, my canoe to bind together, that the river may not wet me." And the larch, with all its fibers, shivered in the air of morning, touched his forehead with its tassels, said with one long sigh of sorrow, "Take them all, O Hiawatha." Now, the point of this, for me, and I hope for you, is that Hiawatha asked the tree. Too often we don't ask, we just take. We can't do that. We can't go on doing that because we're more dependent on trees than they are on us. We could have a world with no humans and there would be trees. We couldn't have a world without trees. So the reason I wrote my book was I wanted to consider the friendship between us, how we rely on each other. Yes, we want them for us, but we need them, and we need to know we need them wherever we are. I know you all want to get home, so I'm going to read you one more little verse from a poem by Robert Frost. The poets quite often spoke for the trees. Many, many poets have spoken for the trees. And this is from a poem called "On a Tree Fallen Across the Road to Hear Us Talk." The tree the tempest with a crash of wood throws down in front of us is not to bar our passage to our journey's end for good, but just to ask us who we think we are, insisting always on our own way so. She likes to halt us in our runner tracks and make us get down in a foot of snow, debating what to do without an axe. Well, we should listen, shouldn't we? And now I'm going to stop talking and hope you'll give me sixpence.